Hello, this is Miss Kennedy. If you're here watching this lecture, you're here probably from AP Environmental Science, and you're here to learn about biogeochemical cycles. So let's get started. So some vocabulary that will be helpful for you to understand before the lecture starts is listed below. I'm not going to go through it all just to save time, so feel free to pause the video to make sure you feel comfortable using some of these words. A couple important ones are inorganic and organic, as well as producer. You'll hear those a lot throughout the lecture, so try and feel comfortable with them. So we're going to study 5 important cycles. As you see down here, we'll focus on the hydrologic, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And we study these 5 cycles to understand how biomes interact and how matter moves within each. So we've learned a little bit about biomes already, and now we want to know how do all biomes kind of work together on Earth in terms of providing us with clean air, water, and our plants can grow happily in all of them. So we're going to focus a lot on matter, which you see down here. Matter would be like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and water. So those different forms of matter are going to move in different ways on Earth, and those are called flows, so the ways in which matter move. Once they get to where they're ready to hang out and stay for a minute, they're going to be in pools. So pools of matter are the places where matter is stored. And it's also really, really important to note that matter on Earth is in a closed system, meaning that matter is never lost, it's only recycled. So if you've taken physics before, you should have learned this as the conservation of matter law, where you can't destroy matter and you can't create matter, you can only recycle it. And that's true even if it seems like we're creating things, we're not. We're just taking resources from the Earth, making more of our own stuff, and then those materials will be recycled back into the Earth system. So we can't ever create matter. Matter's only ever recycled. So there will be some chemical formulas in this lecture and throughout this course, so try to feel comfortable writing out some of the formulas of all these different gases and liquids. Hopefully you know some of them, and it's also important to note that each letter kind of represents what that formula is representing. So if you have CO2, the C represents carbon. So anytime you see the letter C in a formula, you know there's carbon in it. And the same thing with anything with an N in it has nitrogen. So now you know that ammonia has nitrogen in it, which will come in handy later on in the lecture. So try and feel comfortable with some of these. You don't have to memorize all of them, but some of them will be beneficial and you will see them on tests and you might need to use them on tests. So we'll start with the hydrologic cycle, which is basically the water cycle. And we'll start with the sun. Pretty much everything warms up the oceans and creates what's called evaporation as water turns from liquid into a gas. And the same thing happens in plants. Plants give off some water on their leaves, and that water evaporates into the sky. And also that is true of soils. So you have these 3 different places where evaporation occurs from solar energy. So the sun heats up our land and our water, and that creates some evaporation. Some water turns into a gas. It goes from liquid to gas, and then it hangs out in the clouds. Once in the clouds, it will turn into something, either rain or hail or even snow. And then, as we all know, in New York, that will fall onto the land as precipitation. So all these 3 things are precipitation. Once that precipitation hits the land, a bunch of different things are going to happen. So plants will take in that precipitation, and they'll use it for their benefit. But if you remember what I just said, plants actually give off some liquid to the air. So right away you have plants, this cycle start itself over right away. But another thing can happen. Another thing can happen. That was Mr. Barr emailing me. Another thing can happen once precipitation hits land, and it's something called percolation. So it's a really important word for you to know. So we have water can transpire, or it can evaporate. And if you want to sound extra smart at your next party, you can tell people that water does something called evapotranspiration, which is pretty much what I just went over with you, that plants give off water via transpiration or from water in oceans being evaporated. That's called evapotranspiration. So it's pretty much just combining these 2 things to explain the whole process from once it rains, the lakes, the plants, and the soils give off water. That is all called evapotranspiration. The second thing we have is percolation. Sorry, my handwriting is not so great. Percolation, which is basically this process that allows water to sink really, really low, really deep down into the earth, into what's called the groundwater, which is water we can't see. And it's very important for the survival of humans as we start to run out of drinkable water. So water will percolate all the way from the clouds through the layers of soil, which we'll learn about later, all the way down into this groundwater here. And that process is called percolation. Try and think about it just as water sinking. I think that's helpful. But again, another cool party word would be percolation. And the last thing that's going onto land, there's a couple things that will happen. And the final pathway that water can take once it's entered the land is through something called surface runoff. So as water enters the soil, it starts to move towards streams and rivers because water wants to be in more water. So as it enters into those streams and rivers, they usually will flow all the way into oceans. So that's called runoff, water entering land and slowly kind of running its way towards the larger body of water, which would be the ocean. This is called surface runoff. There's another type of runoff that happens in the groundwater that we talked about earlier over here, and we'll get to that later. But it's important to recognize that once runoff enters into the ocean, our entire cycle is going to start again, right? Because as water enters the ocean, the solar energy is going to heat it up and then return that water into the clouds, and our whole process begins again. So that's the hydrologic cycle, and again, it was also important to talk about the human impacts on the hydrologic cycle. This class is kind of a blend between the science and what humans are doing to kind of change the science that we know or change the systems that we're studying. So there are a couple of ways that humans will impact the hydrologic cycle, and they're very important to understand for this course. So the first way that we kind of change the cycle, and again, remember that we can't manipulate the cycle too much because matter can't really be removed or added, but we can impact the cycle by kind of getting in the way of things. So when we cut down trees or we harvest trees, that plays a major role in this cycle for a couple of reasons. But deforestation, as I'm going to call it, is the first way that humans impact the hydrologic cycle. And that's because if you're cutting down trees, you have a less evapotranspiration occurring, right? These plants are not giving off as much water to the clouds. So you have less of this, so the cycle is a little bit different. You know, the cycle had planned for X amount of trees on Earth, and now we have a lot less of those trees, as we're learning throughout the news. So that's the first way that humans have impacted the hydrologic cycle. Less evapotranspiration because there are less plants. Various things have impacted the hydrologic cycle is really through urbanization. So as we start to build larger cities, we need a lot more roads, and we need a lot more sidewalks. And if you look at what our sidewalks and roads are made out of, it's not soil and it's not grass. It's more inorganic compounds like concrete. And these substances aren't as good at absorbing water. They're not as good at percolating water from the surface of the earth into that groundwater storage. So there's less water entering into the groundwater from the clouds. So there's less percolation. And because of that, there's more runoff. So water has no place to go. It can't go down into the earth, so it has to run into the rivers, the streams, and the oceans. So more runoff kind of manipulates that cycle in a way, because more runoff leads to more evaporation, which leads to more runoff. And it's a cycle that's being edited by our urbanization, because we've never seen this kind of change of the planet ever until humans came around. So now we have this edit to our cycle. So our next cycle is the carbon cycle, and this is an incredibly important cycle because carbon is the most important element in all living things. I know you don't think you have carbon in you, but your body has quite a bit of carbon inside of it, and it's used in many ways in your body and in other living things as well. So we really care about the carbon cycle in terms of all living things on Earth. And there are 7 processes that drive the carbon cycle, and we're going to talk about them. But all 7 of these processes are either fast or slow. And if they're fast, that means that something living is helping drive that process. So anything living like a plant or a decomposer like a mushroom, an animal, a human, they're going to be in that fast process. And the slow processes are involving anything non-living. So anything abiotic, a little living environment vocabulary for you, anything like rocks and weather, wind, those are parts of the slow processes. So the first two cycles we're going to focus on are on your chart here. They're photosynthesis, that's our first cycle, and respiration. And in these processes, carbon dioxide is moving. So we know in photosynthesis, plants take in carbon dioxide into their leaves to create sugar. So that's what you're seeing here. Carbon dioxide from the air gets absorbed by the producers. And then as consumers eat those producers, some carbon dioxide is then respired back into the environment as sugars are converted back into carbon dioxide. So that's like when a cow eats a plant and then it farts or burps, it's releasing some carbon dioxide into the environment. But when both of those things die, when a producer or a consumer dies, a decomposer will break down their bodies, basically, and also release some carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So there's a little bit of a mini cycle here. So those are our first two cycles that you're seeing illustrated. And over here is the same thing, but just in the ocean. The same process for ocean organisms. Ocean producers like algae and seaweed and consumers like fish and snails and all that good stuff. So then our third, fourth, and fifth cycles are kind of going to be explained together. Our third cycle is exchange. And this is just basically kind of a sharing relationship between the atmosphere and the ocean. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and carbon dioxide in the water are constantly being exchanged back and forth. So you're never going to see the atmosphere having more carbon dioxide than the ocean. They're constantly being traded through all these processes and directly between both. So you'll see that with this nice big arrow here. Process 4 is sedimentation. So the sedimentation process involves carbon dioxide in the ocean being combined with something called calcium to create calcium carbonate. And calcium carbonate will then attach itself to dust particles or something like that and basically build up into sediments, which is what you're seeing right here. And those sediments are referred to as limestone and dolomite, which are types of rock basically. So they'll build up in sediment and over many, many millions of years slowly grow into mountains and rocks and things like that. So there is a huge amount of carbon stored within the sediment, which is important to note because that will be useful to the atmosphere in a million years once those mountains begin to grow. So sedimentation stores a huge amount of carbon. It's the largest carbon pool in this slow section of the carbon cycle. So the fifth cycle is burial. Oopsie. And that's where some carbon can be buried within the earth, as we just talked about, via biomass. So I talked to you about biomass at the very beginning. It's in the vocab at the beginning of this lecture, but biomass is basically all living things combined as one unit of reference. And as biomass starts to die, it will slowly get buried and eventually become fossil fuels, which we just talked about in the first cycle. So as biomass gets buried underground, it goes through many chemical changes to become usable oils and gases deep underneath the earth. So that's the burial process. And there is carbon dioxide in that because biomass, if you're a dead body, you have some carbon dioxide within you, and if you get buried, that carbon dioxide moves with you. So that's the burial process of the carbon cycle. So the sixth cycle is one that we'll talk about quite a bit, but it's extraction, and that's where humans extract fossil fuels. And that basically just brings carbon to Earth's surface where humans can use it. So this doesn't really alter the carbon cycle because we're just moving carbon from below the Earth to above the Earth. So that doesn't really play a role in manipulating or changing the carbon cycle. But once it's then extracted, it's then combusted. So this is our seventh and final process in the carbon cycle. And fossil fuel is burned and combusted. And as it's burned and combusted for human usage, CO2, or carbon dioxide, is released into the air. And this is a really important step because we've hopefully been learning throughout your career that as carbon dioxide is added to the air, our globe will start to warm up. But carbon has always been added to our air via things like fires and volcanoes. Small amounts of carbon dioxide are added when we have forest fires and when a volcano erupts. But the rate at which humans are extracting fossil fuels has sped this process of carbon dioxide being added to the atmosphere up by quite a bit on the carbon cycle. But it's important to note that without humans, the carbon cycle would be in a steady state. There would be equal amounts of carbon moving in and out of each cycle, and we wouldn't have any issues without humans. But since we have grown in our population, we have seen a huge change to our carbon cycle. So as we burn those fossil fuels, we've greatly increased the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide in our carbon cycle. And that's a really key idea that will come up again and again in this class. So burning of fossil fuels, which is caused by humans, and we're the only ones that do it, has increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And some of you should know that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has a heating property. It creates warmer temperatures, and that leads to global warming. We'll get a little bit more into that later as to why carbon dioxide actually heats up the Earth. There's quite an interesting science to it, but just understand that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere leads to global warming. And as our globe gets warmer, we're going to see more and more changes to our biomes, sadly. And the other way that we are impacting the carbon cycle is the exact same way as the hydrologic cycle with deforestation. Because trees actually store a great amount of carbon in their leaves and their bark, and once you cut them down, not as much carbon dioxide is able to be stored in those trees. So the less trees you have, the more carbon dioxide you have in the air, in the clouds. So it's really important that these trees are getting planted and remaining on our Earth so that they can take in some of the carbon dioxide that's overheating our planet, that's in excess in our atmosphere. So our next cycle is the nitrogen cycle, and we study nitrogen because it has many important properties within our bodies. It helps to make proteins by forming amino acids, and proteins help keep our body functioning and healthy. And it also makes things like DNA and RNA, which give us the instructions for all of our life and make us who we are. So nitrogen is also referred to as the limiting nutrient. And this is because it's very important for growth. We all need it to survive, including plants, but it's not as available as other nutrients. It's not as easy to get. So if we run out of nitrogen, then you're not able to grow. So we refer to that as a limiting nutrient. And you've heard a similar vocabulary word in living environment, a limiting factor. That's whatever factor in an environment stops it from growing to what it could be. So in this case, nitrogen can stop you. If there's not enough nitrogen, you can't grow to what you could be. So that's called the limiting nutrient. Explain the cycles, it might get a little overwhelming as I explain the chemical cycle, so just bear with me. The chemical transformation. So the first chemical transformation we're going to talk about is nitrogen fixation. That's our first one. That's basically where atmospheric nitrogen is taken and converted into something that plants can use. There's tons and tons of nitrogen in the atmosphere, but it's not really available to plants. Plants can't take it and use it in their bodies very easily. It has to be changed into another form. So the atmospheric nitrogen is called N2. So we don't really want it in that form. It's not a good form. We want it to be something that plants and animals can then use. So in a process called biotic fixation, N2 is converted into ammonia. So you start here with your N2, and that's later turned into ammonia by living things called cyanobacteria. Sorry, that's a weird underline. And other bacteria that are in plants. So you have your cyanobacteria, and they usually are in the ocean, helping to convert that N2 into ammonia, which is NH3. Okay, and then also bacteria on legumes. So you'll hear a lot of talk about planting legumes is good for the earth because they fix nitrogen. So legumes are things like beans and peas. So bacteria on those legumes can do the same process of taking nitrogen gas and converting it to a usable form, which is called ammonia. Okay, and this is the biotic process, the living process, the biotic fixation. There's also a process of abiotic fixation, which produces a different form of nitrogen that's also able to be used by plants. So in this process, N2 is converted into nitrates, which is NO3. And that's done by a couple different things. Things like lightning can create this process. Excuse me, I'm writing lightning. Oh, you know what I'm trying to say there. Lightning, combustion from fires, and burning of fossil fuels. Those are all non-living ways of creating this usable nitrogen. Okay, so those are our abiotic fixation. Sorry, my handwriting is so bad, you'll get used to it. And they take nitrogen gas, N2, and they bring it into this usable form. So you can see nitrates begin to get pulled into the cycles on Earth, here, and they get pulled in here, where we want them to, because that's where plants can actually use them. They can be turned into something that plants are able to take in and begin the cycle of producer, consumer, decomposer. So that's really important. That's our first step within this process. Okay? So our next step, our next transformation is called nitrification. I'm sorry, I'm having some trouble talking. And that's where nitrifying bacteria convert ammonium into nitrate and then to nitrite. So I know we're getting a little bit confusing with the gases here, but nitrification is super simple. It starts right here. So nitrification begins at the ammonium stage and turns it from this into this. And that, again, makes it more available to plants. So taking it from this ammonium into nitrates means more producers can use it. So that's nitrification. And then we have assimilation. This is a little bit easier to understand, so you can take a minute to breathe here. But assimilation involves producers taking up either ammonium or nitrate. So they take it into their bodies, into their tissues, and they use it, and then when consumers eat them, which we see here, consumers will eat the producers, they will take some of that nitrogen the producers have. So then it's moving along that cycle. And of course the decomposers will come to break it down later. So that's assimilation. Consumers take up the nitrogen that the producers once had by eating them. Very simple. And then our next one, our fourth of 5 cycles is called, or transformations, is called mineralization. And that's simple. And it's this last little leg here where decomposers in this ecosystem, in the soil, on land, or in the water, in the ocean cycles, they break down that nitrogen within living things and they turn it into ammonium. So in living things, that nitrogen usually takes a different form than ammonium. It'll look like nitrates or other forms. And they take that nitrate and turn it back into ammonium. And that's really important because it keeps that cycle flowing from land to the atmosphere as well. So mineralization is decomposers breaking down the nitrogen into ammonium, or NH4. And that can also be used by plants and animals within ocean ecosystems and land. So you're having these mini cycles within this larger cycle. So that's mineralization. And then the last one is denitrification, which is really an important step because it keeps the entire cycle connected. If you took out this step of denitrification, you wouldn't have the rest of the complete cycle. So basically, denitrifying bacteria, they live in this anaerobic environment. And anaerobic just means there's not very much oxygen. It's an oxygen-poor environment. So it's like a soil with not very much oxygen or very stagnant or non-moving water. And they live there and they convert nitrate, they take nitrate from the water or the soil, and they turn it back into nitrogen gas. So now we're getting back to N2. And I know we said we didn't really want N2, but once the denitrifying bacteria create that N2, it cycles all the way back into the air. So we've gone through all these crazy loops and turns just to get the denitrifying bacteria to grab some of the usable nitrogen in the form of nitrates and turn it back into the unusable form of nitrogen into the gaseous form so that the cycle can continue on and on and on. So we've made it through our cycle. I know it looks totally crazy, so rewind if you need to. You're free to ask questions once you get into class. I know it's a very intense cycle, but it's really important for our environment. So the nitrogen cycle is a really delicate cycle, and having excess amounts of nitrogen isn't really a good thing in a lot of ecosystems. So it's a delicate cycle you don't really want to mess with, but we have messed with the cycle, and I'll get into that right now. So there's one vocab word I want you to understand, which is leaching. And that's basically just molecules that are broken down or dissolved, are transported. And this is not something you really see. It's obviously very microscopic, but they're transported through the soil on land via the groundwater. So they'll make their way into groundwater and then from groundwater to other areas. So this leaching isn't really a good thing because it takes nitrogen from some places and puts it where it shouldn't be. And that happens a lot because humans have started to create their own fertilizers to add nitrogen to soil to make healthier soil, because plants love nitrogen. They want more of it. So as humans make fertilizers, those fertilizers can sometimes go where they're not supposed to go, and also through the process of leaching, those fertilizers, which are rich in nitrogen, those fertilizers will end up places that they don't belong. So we only did 3 cycles today, which is fine because there's a lot of information in each of those cycles, and we will continue on with the phosphorus and sulfur cycle at a later point. Please make sure you write any questions down, any notes you feel like you need to take from this video, because this is where you're getting all the information for this chapter. And then we'll work on activities and problems and questions in class. So this is really your chance to get the material down and then come to class ready to talk about it, ready to work on it.